Alright, so let's start with our first art element, which is the art element of line. Line we're starting with because it's in a way the most basic, simple form of artistic expression. But I find it pretty interesting because it's also fairly complex if we think about it, because lines don't really exist in nature. They're basically a human construct. They're an abstraction, a shorthand usually of what we and how we see. For instance, if we look at this example here, this is a page out of the sketchbook of Leonardo da Vinci. This is known as the Vitruvian Man, where he's working on a particular proportional issue or problem that he's trying to work out, which he's obviously worked out here pretty well. And you can see on the top and the bottom he's given himself little notes about this as well. And so, for instance, if you see like the side of his leg or the side of his body where that line is pretty harsh, that wouldn't exist in nature. That's not really something that exists. It's really just where one object begins and then another one ends that we draw a line. And so, like I said, it's more of a visual shorthand, rather than something that we actually perceive. And so it's pretty interesting in that regard. Also, if you think about all that line does in today's society, even in our modern world, we have so much electronic usage and things like that. We still use line for, say, like our signature, the particular way that you sign your name, that kind of fingerprint, so to speak, gives the world your identity and your approval in some cases. In addition to that, if you look at the other arts, for instance, like music can be recorded using lines. The way you would put a particular note, indicating if it's a half note or an eighth note, whatever the case might be, and you can show where that note would be in terms of pitch by where it's located on a staff, which is basically just 5 horizontal lines as well. All of that can really be indicated using lines. Same thing with the words that I'm saying. With the words that I'm saying, you'd be able to spell out just with different lines that we would call letters. Letters make up words, and so you can get the message across that way. And so there are a lot of things that line does that we probably don't truly appreciate. Alright, so moving on here, if we look at line from an artistic standpoint, they really can have their own personality or their own identity. Lines can be very thin, they can be very thick, they can be very expressive, very elegant, or very static and passive as well. And so there's a whole range of things that you can get just using simple line. Interestingly, I think line is one of the few things I can think of that would be finite or infinite. If you were to draw a line on a sheet of paper that started in one place and ended in one place, it would definitely be finite. You can see where it starts and where it ends. But if you were to draw a line that goes all the way across the picture plane, you'd never know where it starts and finishes, and so that would be an example of it being infinite. Okay, so of our basic types of line and the basic usages of line, we'll see here with some other examples. All right, so if we look at this example, this is basically a straightforward figure drawing. It's pretty much a sketch of what the figure would look like in front of the artist here. And we get a good indication of this figure just using these really basic lines. That you can see a lot of straight lines, a lot of curved lines are being used. And that gives us very good structure. We know for the most part what this body would look like before us, not only in its form, but also in the gesture that we see or the motion that we see that's being displayed as well. Okay, with this example, I put this example kind of together so we can see how a line might be different depending on the I guess maybe tool we would be using. For instance, on the left we have a pencil. And so with this pencil we have this sketch of this cow. And if you look at the bottom of the cow, you can see that the grass is being indicated just with kind of this zigzag kind of meandering line. And the character of the sketch itself on the left is very gestural. And so, kind of similar to the figure that we saw earlier, that it does get a lot of information down pretty quickly. We get a pretty good indication of not only what this animal is, but what this animal would look like in terms of its spots and different things, little details like that. Okay, if we contrast that type of gestural type of mark with the picture on the right of the rhino there, which would probably have been done by some type of Illustrator process in the computer, we can see that they have more of a consistent line. It's a little bit of a thicker line. It doesn't have as much of that gestural quality to it. And so if we look especially down here, like in the legs, we can see that it's being built up with a straight, curved, curved, straight, curved, straight, curved, straight. That is basically all being constructed with these straight lines and meeting up with the curved lines, which is true also of the pencil line as well. It's just kind of meanders a little bit more. It's not as I guess as easily to see as in the illustration example on the right. Okay, and so if we look at this, we can see basically two of our three basic lines, or basic types of lines. We have basically curved and we have straight, and they're usually used in conjunction with each other. A line might take a straight course and then bend slightly one way or the other, but that's one of two things that lines can do: go either straight or go curved. And the third type that we don't see would be something we would call an implied line. That would be, for instance, like a series of dots or a dashed line. Something like that would be considered an implied line. And so those would be kind of our three different types of line: the straight, the curved, and the implied. And so in addition to that, we basically have the different directions that line can go. It can go vertical, horizontal, or diagonal. Those are the basic paths that the line could go as well. Now with that section, the horizontal, the vertical, or the diagonal, that can have an influence on us as a viewer. That if we have a straight up and down line, that's going to give us a different impression than a horizontal line that's straight. For instance, a horizontal line will give us more of a feeling of rest, whereas a diagonal line will give us more of a sense of movement. Also, generally speaking, a curved line usually will send us more of an indication of movement than a straight line too. And so, as a viewer, we need to be aware of what these lines do to us as far as how they might make us see a particular image. Because, as we'll see later on in terms of our principles of design, that the artist can use these directions to influence where we look at a particular work of art. Okay, so moving on here, if we look at these next examples, I have this one as an example basically of how different two works of art can be using the same element of art, in this case the one that we're studying, the element of line. On the left, we see a picture of a camel by the artist Picasso. And so it's a good example of basically a gestural study where with this one line he gives us this indication of a camel in this very stylized, abstract type of way. On the right, we see it used more in a naturalistic type of setting. On the right, we have that as an example of a work of art done by Rembrandt. And so these are two of the best artists, printmakers, and painters that we see as far as really in history, and they have very different styles, obviously, but they're both using line to full effect, albeit kind of opposite effects here. One simple and one very much more complex. Okay, with this example we have basically kind of a portrait, and it's interesting because it's really just like about 20 lines, just 20 vertical lines here, and based on the width in some areas and based on how it gets thinner in other areas, just by varying that width throughout the course of each of those lines, we see that a shape basically emerges. In this case, it's a portrait of Marilyn Monroe. So very, like I said, simple, very basic, but visually very interesting. Okay, this is an example from op art in the 20th century, and when I said earlier that lines could give us a sense of movement, I wasn't joking. This definitely gives us a sense of movement if we stare at it for any length of time. And it is pretty interesting because the lines themselves don't move at all. It's just this visual sensation that we get from that movement of the line being repeated over and over again here. And then here, our last example that we'll look at line is another example of just all of the different things that you can accomplish with the line. That with this particular example here, the whole thing is constructed using the very fine lines that you would get in a detailed engraving, which this artist, his name is Albrecht Dürer, was known for. And so all of the effects that you see in this particular example are used with that basic art element of line. All right, so this should be it for line, and the next one will be shape. So we'll see you with that one soon.